Well, thank you all for hanging in here. We've got a couple great speakers here already this morning, and I hope I can live up to that. That's good stuff. Really appreciate being invited to do this. Forages are of a passion for me, and I've spent most of my career trying to get people to put up higher quality forages. So let's keep going. Here's a picture from the Noble Institute, but picture of some small grains, and we just see some differences in them, in their maturities. Obviously planted the same day, taking this picture. So we see some differences. That's kind of the nature of them within species and across species. We're going to have some differences, but it's all about your management. I'm a big fan of small grain forages. I think they have a tremendous amount of opportunity and value. I've been looking at them for 40 years, and matter of fact, go back 50, 60 years, we grew them on the farm. So I think they're a good fit for our upper Midwest. When we think about, which ones we talking about, well, any of them can work. And I put winter in front of some of them just because of the kind of the nature of the way I like them, but certainly rye, triticale, wheat, barley, oats, and I did put a little caveat in the oats that, yeah, oats are a spring crop, but I'm going to talk about fall oats later on as well, how they have some advantages and certainly can make some really good forage as well. And again, you can get excellent forage from any of these crops. And I always think, corn is the king, alfalfa is the queen, grasses seem to be maybe down in that bishop knight kind of a feel, and small grains must be barely a pawn. They just don't get a lot of respect. They're kind of an afterthought in a lot of cases, and I don't think they should be. Certainly we run into cases where we want to be thinking about them, and one is in emergency forage supply situations. If we kind of go back to 2012, we know we had some drought issues there, so we came through with shorter supplies there. And certainly we know on occasion we can have some of these winter kill issues that happen. And so we need to add, or we need some add to our inventory, or we have some need for emergency forage supplies, because we're going to have to replant, and we're going to need some forage soon. And what an opportunity for a small grain nurse crop reseeding alfalfa situations that we can come up with. And as I said, small grain forage is kind of perceived to be too high in fiber, too low in quality for high producing dairy cows. It's lower in crude protein. I think we put a little too much emphasis on crude protein as a gauge of how good a forage is. But even for beef cattle, and whether that might be in a backgrounding situation or certainly forage supply for our brood cows, they might be a nice supplement to add to our corn stock bale-based kind of feedings, or some of those situations like that. And so I think we really need to take another look at it. And a lot of the reason that they have been kind of considered not good enough is because they haven't been managed to be good enough. And if we just plant it as a kind of an afterthought, that's kind of the crop we're going to get. We don't go that way if we're planting corn or alfalfa. We take our efforts to make it successful. I think that's what we need to think about. This is the slide here is a great illustration of forage in general. And this is a slide I got from Dan Undersander, and it is a slide that's used to talk about the Harv Extra alfalfa. But I've borrowed it as a kind of an illustration of forage quality all around. And what you see here, as I brought this circle up, is there's a point between trade-off between yield and our quality, where we want to be kind of focusing on our harvest. Now, if I had this in a PowerPoint development mode, whatever, instead of showing here, I could click on that circle and move it around different places. And actually, that's not a bad thing to think about. The circle is not perfect. The lines don't cross for everybody at the same place. If we're feeding high producing dairy cows, yeah, that's going to be a little different. If we're feeding big round bales of small grain forages to our beef cows right now during the winter, well, there's certainly a different kind of forage that we need, and a different maturity wise that could work, different protein levels. And so, and that's actually a nice thing about small grain forages, is that even though protein gets down, fiber goes up, they still have a value. And I'm going to show some other things about how they digest, but think about small grain forages much like cool season grasses. They grow best during the cool season. They're going to test a lot the same if we manage them similar to cool season grasses. And so think about, is it a something like a brome grass situation, brome grass, orchard grass, even the fescues, how those cool season grasses grow and when they grow best and all that. A lot of that same thing applies to our small grains. So as we think about, okay, what's the forage value that we're looking at? What is forage value? And forage value is in the high yield of valuable nutrients. Typically, we look at crude protein when we think about the high value nutrient, and protein's expensive, and it typically comes out of pocket if we have to buy it off the farm, whether that's soybean meal or some other type of protein. And so it's an out-of-pocket cost. I really think we do not realize the importance enough of digestible NDF. And NDF is our fiber measurement, and digestible NDF is so critical because it supplies energy. And, you know, whether it's a milking cow or a lactating beef cow or a growing stocker or whatever, energy typically is more lacking than protein is. And so we talk about protein a lot. I know lots of times when I've looked at forage tests, or people look at their forage tests, oh, what's the protein level? Well, that's certainly something to look at, but it's not the main thing. I really want us to think about digestible forage. So what is NDF? And if you've been to any of talks I've done over the last how many years, you know, I talk about NDF, and so that we understand NDF. And NDF is a measurement of the fiber. It's a measure of the cell wall components. So think about it as in any room you're in, if you opened up the door and it was full of water, all that would run out. So that's typically of how the NDF is what's left, the shell, the foundation. Think of it even like a apartment building or a hotel or something where you have all kinds of rooms and all kinds of doors and everything. If you emptied all that out, what you have is the fiber structure left. But that fiber structure is made up of pectins, hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin. The digestibility and the completeness of that digestibility goes down from top to bottom there. And so pectin is just like 100% digestible. Hemicellulose, very digestible, almost 100% if you get it all. Cellulose, it'll vary because we start running into that one on the bottom there, that lignin, and that is indigestible. There are no digestible lignases in the rumen of ruminants. And so if we got lignin, it tends to bind together, ties up with the cellulose, and everything starts going down in digestibility. And so hence the reason for the Harb Extra, low lignin alfalfas and stuff, but also hence the beauty of cool season grasses and small grains. Cellulose is made up of glucose units. So is starch. They're bonded a little differently. Starch comes apart much easier, much faster, but they're glucose units, and that's what supplies energy. So here we have a illustration of different forages that are listed on the bottom. and amounts of NDF. So off to the right side, you see a percent NDF. So that's the total fiber. Everything above it in that white is really what was inside the cell. Open up the door and it went out. So what's left is the NDF fiber structure. And that's what we want to try to digest. So everything above the gray there is, again, shows different amounts of NDF. It actually, interesting enough, ADFs, which isn't, in my opinion, the best fiber measurement in itself, but it's part of also inside the NDF. ADF is that, it's a different way of measuring forage. But what we want to look at is total NDF and how much of that NDF we can digest. And so if we go on the bottom there, you see SS, sorghum sudan, warm season, summer annual, something you might have considered growing for emergency forage, maybe filling in a forage supply in the summer when our pastures are getting short. We bring in a period where we graze that or whatever. Then we have the small grains, or it could be a cool season grass. And you see the two differences there. Then we go to alfalfa, lowest in NDF, but also you'll notice it's lower in what's the potential of that NDF to be digested. How much is there? Well, there's not as much there, in all honesty, and what's there is not as digestible. And then over way in the right of the four forages there, we have corn silage. Corn silage is kind of a sometimes mis-evaluated forage supply, because in reality, we talk about NDF percent, 40% of dry matter. Well, remember, corn silage compared to the other forages, there's a lot of grain there. And so it looks like it's lower in NDF. That's not necessarily right or a good thing. If we looked at just the forage portion, which remember, grain is 45% of that corn plant in the corn silage. So really we have a warm season crop that's about 60% NDF if we just think about the forage. As we try to think about good digestibility corn silage, it's that fodder portion, the plant portion, not the grain. So the other part of the equation is the NDFD 30, or as Jerry talked about, neutral detergent fiber digestibility. And 30 is a 30-hour measurement. And we can look at other ones as well, but that's what we're looking at. And if you look at the sorghum sudan, the small grains, the corn silage portion fiber, whatever, those are 60% NDFD digestibility. And so that's good. Alfalfa, it might be 45, it might be 50. It's an unusually good alfalfa to be up in the 50s. And so again, as Jerry talked about, we can improve our digestibility just by bringing in cool season grasses, because we're bringing in 60% NDFD versus 45. So kind of think about that. We're thinking about NDF and NDF digestibility to supply energy. Might as well try to get as much out of it as we can. So here's a little bigger version of that. And again, just so you can see that, the other part is the darker gray portion of the ADF is actually ash. And typically we can see some different ash contents. Alfalfa tends to be high, but we can also get higher ash contents. We can get 10% ash in sorghum sedans. We can get ash contents higher in anything if we're dragging it with the rake or dirt, whatever. So ash content is important to keep a track of. We like to have, less than 10% ash in our forages, just from a standpoint, some of that ash is minerals, not all bad, but we don't want to be getting, if we're over 10% ash, we're probably picking up some soil. Okay, got a couple slides here that are showing NDF digestibility. And this is a couple slides here from Mike Allen at Michigan State, some unpublished data that he had a grad student they were working on, and where they plotted out some digestibilities, NDF digestibilities over time. And again, we talked about NDFD 30. because 30 hours is kind of an average residence time of forages in the rumen. Some was faster, some was slower. And again, on the average, it's not a bad measurement to compare forages. Some people also use an NDF-D 48, 2 days. And then we also have undigested NDF. And that's not digestible at all, but that tends to fill cows or fill animals up. All right, let's go back to the slide here. You'll notice the top 2 lines here on this particular slide shows triticale silage and wheat silage. Notice that it's higher than the alfalfa and higher than the corn silage. Again, we've got cool season grasses because small grains, they are better in NDF digestibility. And if you look at alfalfa, that's the one that actually starts out the highest. And alfalfa is very good, very fast for about 12 to 24 hours. And what are we digesting there? We're digesting the leaves. And that's why it's important to not lose many leaves in our harvest time. But you also notice about the alfalfa line is that it tends to flatten out after a few hours, or get over in that over a day to 2 days, 48 hours, whatever. It's pretty much done digesting, and that's the stems. And so we have that trade-off, one, trying to get high quality forage in alfalfa. But I'm not the biggest fan of taking those disc mowers and cutting as low as we can, because all we're doing is gaining stems, but we're not gaining digestible forage. And also, I'm a big fan, obviously, of putting grasses in my mixes. And so grasses need to have that cutter height up at 4 inches, because grasses need some plant material to grow back from. Alfalfa grows out of the crown, grasses grow from the above ground. So it takes grass to grow grass. Good way to cut alfalfa or cut grasses out of your alfalfa stand is mow it short, and you'll kill the grass off. So that was a jump back to Jared's talk there a little bit. But if we look again, the potential is really good for small grains forages. We're going to jump one more. And again, we've got the same corn silage and alfalfa plotted here. We've got some sorghum Sudan, which is a little bit better. But again, we've got some oat silage, which is that top line. So as me as a nutritionist, when I look at forage quality, that's pretty important to me to see that high digestibility. And so over time, it may not be the super fastest digesting to start off with, but it's got a lot of digestible NDF. So again, we kind of go back to those illustrations where I showed about the digestible NDF and the different potential amounts with those forages. And so really what we're doing, we're just going to do the math of whatever forage we have. We try to get it harvested, and then we can measure how much NDF is there. And so we look at a ration and can see what can we get out of that, how much energy, and how many pounds of that forage, what's the percent NDF. So now we have pounds of NDF, just like we could take that portion away, and we've got a pile of digestible NDF that we're feeding the cow. And then how much is going to digest in 30 hours for a example, or as an average amount. And then what we really want to get to is when we're feeding whatever animal it is how much actual pounds of digestible NDF they are consuming every day. And so it couldn't be from a high producing dairy cow, and their dry matter intake could be 55, 60 pounds of dry matter. Could be a beef cow right now, she's eating about 25 pounds of dry matter. We got goats and sheep, same kinds of things. We think about our lactating goats when that time comes, how our forages has to be maybe a little better than it can be when they're just browsing and in a dry period or whatever. So different things to think about, but ultimately, good quality forage has high amounts of digestible NDF. Okay, undigested NDF 240. That's what fills the cows up. That's what fills any animal up. Because one, it's in the rumen longer. Obviously, a rumen is kind of like a big room. And if you have a room with lots of people in there, you can't get more people in until somebody leaves. And so the room is a lot the same way with the forage. If it's not digestible, the room is full. The rumen is full. We got to digest it. And if it's slower, takes a little longer for those people to leave before more people can come in. You know, sitting down at a restaurant or something like that. It's kind of the same kind of thing. Now, sometimes that's okay. If we think about our beef cows right now, what do we want to do? We want to keep them full and we want to keep them warm. And so when we've got forages that digest, but they're digesting slower and they're filling them up, that's a good thing. You know, and maybe we're using corn stalks and grass hay bales or whatever, but we could also use small grain baleage or something to supplement those. Again, as we look at small grain forage, undigested NDF, and we use an undigested NDF 240 because 240 hours, 10 days. If it's not digested in 10 days, probably not going to at all. And we probably pretty well know that by 2-3 days. But those are the kind of things that if you have high UNDF 240, the cow is not able to eat as much. And so sometimes that, again, won't hurt us. Sometimes it can really hurt us. Going down through there again, you know, as you think about other forages and maybe something that fits into your forage system, summer annuals, cool season grasses, alfalfa tends to be higher in undigested NDF because of the stems. And so it could be over 20% NDF. And that's why we've seen a little shift away from high alfalfa diets for high producing dairy cows because of those kind of things. We just, you know, Jerry talked about in New York, they love the corn silage. Yep, corn silage and some other forages to go with that, just because they're getting better digestibility. Okay, so let's kind of focus back a little bit to the in-field stuff, and you know, really we ask ourselves some questions. If we're going to grow small grain forages, you know, why do we want to do it? When do we want to do it? And what are we going to grow? And notice I got what are we going to grow as the bottom. That is the least of our concerns, really, as we think about how to manage them. The why and the when are probably more important. You know, these days we're looking at some additional things to the forage supply. Yeah, we need forage supply. And as I talked about earlier, we might have situations where we need an emergency forage. We need some more supply, whatever the case might be. And maybe we're going to reestablish our some of our hay fields, and it's a good opportunity. And I'm sitting here in southeast Minnesota. We live between Houston and Caledonia, and it's pretty rolly. You know, we're in the driftless area, and I'm obviously a pretty big fan of using nurse crop. I don't like straight seeded alfalfas because we got a lot of bare ground out there for a couple of months, and that makes me nervous. If we get a big rain, I hate seeing soil washing off. And we have Beaver Creek grows right through our farm, and that's a good way I can monitor what's happening on the soil loss. And so the other thing is crop rotations. We're going to talk some of this afternoon about some of the small grain for grain options. And I think those are great ideas. I think we need to break up our corn soy rotations. I think we've got some weed issues that we need to do some rotations. And so we can do a small grain in there every 2, 3, 4 years, whatever that is. I think that's a value to it. Anytime we can bring some rotations in. And if we can do it, we got livestock and we can do a forage supply, that's even better from our standpoint. We're also certainly looking at the potential of them as cover crops. And that's where maybe the winter cereal rye, the winter triticale comes in. Maybe we're also looking at it as incorporating a cover crop, and certainly a nurse crop was a cover crop that we did, been doing that for tens and tens of years. So one of the things, if we're going to need or try to just do some additional forage supply, and maybe we've even to the point where I want to just do annual crops because I'm going to rotate. I'm going to use my annual crops for forage supply. And we can think about how a small grain crop fits into that. And there's certainly lots of potential. If we're going to do it and do it successfully, we need to bring our management up along with it. And so obviously we can vary our yield quite a bit just by what's the fertility out there and when are we going to cut it, stuff like that. It's a cool season crop, so it's going to grow best in the cool season. When is that? Well, spring until maybe early June or into the fall, middle of August on. Cool season crops grow better then. We're going to have to think about how much we want to plant. If it's a nurse crop, a lot of times we say, oh, plant a bushel of oats. Is there any thought given to how many seeds we're putting out there? And it's interesting, oats have as many seeds per pound as barley and wheat do, but the pile is bigger. And so they're bulkier and it behaves a little differently. So if we're only putting a bushel out there, we only have a 36-pound bushel versus a 60-pound bushel or a 56-pound bushel. We have to think about that because those, if we're doing by volume and not by weight, you're not going to have as many plants out there. And maybe in a nurse crop, we don't want to because of the risk of lodging and smothering and stuff. But again, if we harvest early enough, that won't be as issue either. Some other strategies where we can incorporate our small grains in, and certainly, and we're seeing a lot of it in Minnesota, it's a great thing to do, put on some kind of a winter crop, winter cover crop after the corn silage comes off. And we can do winter rye, we can do winter trit. Those have to be my two favorites. If you're going to start out doing that, winter rye is obviously very successful. It's pretty forgiving. Winter trit, if you're looking at your forage potential, it offers a little bit of a later maturing come spring. And so it opens up your window a little bit. I always like to say, if I'm going to do winter trit, I'm going to harvest it Memorial Day weekend. And then that gives you the options. What are you coming back with in your rotation? And as we set up 3 and 5 year rotations on the farm, we can incorporate these things into cover crop, forage supply, and then also through our other cropping rotation. Another thing we can think about, alfalfa, 3rd year. And whether that's 3rd year or 4th year, again, I kind of like turning those fields over. And I think there's advantages when we do that, when we rotate crops and we put corn onto coming off a cover crop or even into the alfalfa, you get the boost from the nitrogen, you get the boost because of soil health and things like that versus a corn on corn. And we're all just breaking that corn soy rotation. So we've got some potentials there. But a lot of times that alfalfa crop, the 3rd or 4th year, it's not as productive as it was. And not only that, your 4th cutting may be the least profitable of the cuttings you could do. So maybe why don't we take it out right after we cut 3rd cutting and then come back with a small grain crop growing into the fall, going to produce a whole lot more forage. Maybe it's something we can incorporate into our grazing plan. So think about that. So maybe we even have to back it off 3rd cut or 3rd year alfalfa or 4th year alfalfa. Maybe we just take off the 1st year and then take off after the 1st cutting, come back with something else. The other thing of these schemes is we're thinking about maybe manure management in addition to the crop rotations or grazing options. Think about how you put your grazing plan together. When am I going to have some gaps? When can I fill it for some grazing things? And so again, in a 2-year span, we can get 3 forage options out of that, as well as getting our other benefits. Seeding rates, depth of drilling, these are important things. And again, I know a lot of times when we're doing a nursery crop, we're thinking a bushel of oats. You know, it's been the typical recommendation. Yeah, because of some of that risk of having lodging, probably more than anything. But seeding rates, if you're going to go for forage and using a forage oats, then we're going to be talking 100 pounds to the acre. And whether that's oats, whether that's barley, whether that's spring trit, 100 pounds is something that we're recommending. Certainly consider your fertility that's there. Any herbicide carryover. Back in the days, 40, 50 years ago, when we had atrazine a little more prevalent, we always could tell where we might have overlapped a little bit on the sprayer. We had some issues at the headlands or something where the oats wouldn't grow. So we have to think about those things. But the other thing I mentioned, depth of drilling there. One of the things, winter trit is much more sensitive to seeding depth of 1.5 inches kind of minimum, but also the date that it's planted is more crucial. You just don't want to plant winter trit probably after the middle of September, and the 1st September is definitely better. Get that growth, get some roots established, or you're more sensitive with shallow planting and too late a planting. You're very sensitive to getting winter kill with winter trit. It's not as forgiving as the winter rye is. Silage management and baleage, a couple other things just to kind of hit on. I think Jared talked about some of those things. You know, if we're making baleage, 6 to 8 wraps, same kind of moistures as we would do for regular baleage, you know, 60% to 65% moisture. I like that. If we're going to put it in a bag, if we're going to put it in a bunker, you know, I think a 1/2 inch theoretical cut is really good. We don't want to get it too long. It does tend to get a little more spongy kind of if it is too dry and too long a cut. So 60 to 65% moisture, 1/2 inch theoretical cut, put lots of weight on those packing tractors, make sure you got your tension right on the bag or whatever it is, and we can have some nice forage put up that way. Baleage, again, 6 to 8 wraps. And I really like when I see guys doing 8 to 10 wraps. We've got all this money invested, every other dollar invested to get the crop to that point. What's a couple more wraps to make sure that we preserve it good? Don't have those white mold issues, things like that. This is a illustration I used from Laura Payne over in Wisconsin. And when I first saw it, I thought, that's a really good idea. I wish I would have thought of it. Basically, what she did was put up when certain forage crops grow and kind of show when you can fill some gaps or when you need to. And this is really valuable to think about, not only for small grain forages, but any of your grazing situations, your beef cow herd, where, you know, our cool season pastures tend to be very productive in the spring. And then if it gets hot and dry, their productivity drops off quite a bit. Well, there are ways to put that, fill some of those gaps. Warm season perennials, which we don't have a lot of around, but warm season annuals could be. Or cool season annuals like oats, maybe filling in a gap in the fall where we're going to rest our pasture, let that stockpile a little bit or recover. Different options to think about. I can remember back in about the mid to late 60s, we were growing oats for some forage. We obviously did it with the nurse crop, and instead of we didn't need all of it to go for oats and straw. So we chopped some and put it in the silo. But I remember even back in the 60s, we were already talking about harvesting in the boot stage. And so we've known about this a long time, but we don't always get it harvested in the boot stage. We've talked before about moisture levels, chop length, packing, still holds true. Matter of fact, small grain silages sometimes can be a little more prone to mustiness or something if we don't get packing, because it is more difficult to pack. Got to have the weight there. And then we can use those forages in different ways in different diets. Okay, got a slide here that I want to circle around here a couple times here. One, you see, this is an illustration from about 1954 on small grain growth stages. And so it's kind of divided into three parts. The first part, leaf and tiller, is a little bigger part. Then you got stem elongation, jointing, we call it, whatever, as things start stretching out. And then way over to the right, we've got the head emergence and the flowering. And then obviously, if you're taking it all the way to grain. So you can see on the right side of that middle section that we got in the boot. And if we are doing dairy type rations where we want to have maybe higher protein, 18%, we want good fiber digestibility, again, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the boot stage. The flag leaf comes out, it tends to, be at the top, and then it bends over. And so that's a good one to do that. And again, depending on spring crop, winter trit, whatever, we got to watch that carefully, because depending on the spring and the season, how quickly that changes heat wise and things like that can get away from us. And we also have the detriment potential of the weather and rain, and we can't get in there. It happens. Yep. But we still probably have something. If harvested correctly, we can feed it to them. And certainly some stuff like that to think about. One of the things too, just to make sure I don't forget about it, if we do a spring oats or a spring trit, a lot of times we talk about, well, should we put peas with it? Well, yes and no. And as a good extension answer, it depends. Certainly peas can be an added benefit. Their greatest benefit is in early harvested forage. It helps that we're getting that pea crop as forage when it's immature. If we let the oats or trit or whatever go all the way to heading, because we're trying to get it to dry down a little bit, and certainly at the flag leaf boot stage kind of stuff, that stuff's pretty lush. It takes a good wide windrow to get that to dry down, and certainly with peas in it. And so we want to dry it down as fast as we can, wide windrows, because we want to get it off as fast as we can so we don't kill our new alfalfa. If we let it go to heading out, we could be getting to where those peas growing in there are 60 days old. And much like I showed you with the alfalfa, we now are getting stems in those peas that are old and not digestible. So if we get peas in the crop already going to where they're forming peas in the pods, you are losing forage quality pretty fast. So something to think about, and depend on what you're feeding. Nothing wrong with letting it go to a heading flowering stage, not really soft dough or anything, but we know obviously as you look even at those plants, we really increase the tonnage. And if we're feeding beef cows, feeding young stock or something, well, it might be just fine to do that. I want to just show you some real quick where I first got working with small grain forages back in the 80s. Some of the work I was doing, and I was feeding triticale, and that's when the trical thing first came out, and we were looking at triticale as a forage, and just show you that we had very comparable milk production, and it was good quality triticale. We put up the forages good. We compared it with oats. We were looking at a lot of different forages, and very happy with how the triticale performed. So that's what first kind of got me looking at, hey, these can be good forages. Want to quick touch on heifer and dry cow diets. Small grain forages are great heifer and dry cow diets, but be careful with dry cows getting close to calving and transition time. And I show here some composition of the forage minerals, and I got calcium, phosphorus, and potassium. And if you know about some of the potential problems of potassium and milk fever, we want to look at that calcium levels in these, and these small grain forages, much like grasses also, can be luxury consumers. And when we've got a 3.7% potassium in a forage, that's not a close-up dairy diet. We will have problems. So nothing wrong with thinking about them, but as we look at sometimes some real high forage diets for those dry cows, make sure we're monitoring the minerals and looking at that. Here's some more recent work done by Heather Darby up at the University of Vermont, and has some differing forages here. Look at the line of digestible NDF. It is certainly good. This was her chart put off. The actually NDFD percent should be a big D at the end of that, but just so you're looking at the same thing when you look at your forage tests. But again, barley, triticale, high in digestible NDF. Oats, not as much. Wheat can vary. The other thing I wanted to show you was why I like oats and triticale is we look at the dry matter tons per yield there, and barley, although it can be very good quality, it tends not maybe to yield quite as much tonnage. Wheat also, wheat can be good forage, but typically maybe not quite as much. It does give us sometimes a little bigger window to harvest. It's a little later maturing, but again, any of those can work. We can have some good forage. The in vitro dry matter digestibility, the column way to the right, that's always something that in small grain forages can be misleading. I don't really look at it very much, but if we charted that, how that changes over time of maturity, and then once we start putting grain in there, it gets a little bit confusing because it looks better than it really is. Okay, I wanted to talk about fall planted oats. And this is something that really has some potential and interest things there, that when we plant small grain forages, specifically oats, in this case, about the middle of August, and this came out of some work by Pat Hoffman, Dan Understander, and the group over there in Wisconsin. It is, we're planting it when it can grow into a cool season, but it also, it behaves differently because as the days are getting shorter, it is fooling the plant. When you plant it in the spring, oats has a basic goal: produce seed, and the days are getting longer, and that's all triggers the day length, triggers the maturity and the rate of it. And when we change that and we grow into the fall, days are getting shorter, it doesn't produce a seed head, but it's accumulating a lot of sugars in the plant. So it can be a really good fall forage option. Something to think about. Sometimes we put in maybe some other things. We might put a couple of pounds of turnips. Some people put some radish in, depending on cover crop. But if we want to get forage, we might even put a little annual ryegrass in there or something. You can open up a window of a couple months potential of grazing for your beef herd or young stock into the fall.
And one anecdote to go along with that is we planted a cover crop plot down in southwest Wisconsin this past year, and had that same experience. It was mainly just to kind of visually evaluate on a small plot basis, but the fall forage oats were by far kind of the leafiest and tallest growing of most other species in that plot, and especially as compared to a grain variety, the fall forage oats really did seem to show up quite significantly, and would imagine that would translate very well to forage quality, etc.
Yes. Yep. So it's a great, yep, it's a forage type variety of small grain, and it's also a great cool season time to grow. It is really wonderful forage. So just a couple other ones. I'm going to keep moving on here. We've had some other more recent research things that have been done, putting wheat and triticale silage in, comparing that some small summer annuals to the small grain silages. Quick run through some of those. They did 3x3 Latin squares. In other words, cows every couple of weeks got fed something different and would be evaluated then how milk production was, stuff like that. Not a lot of the forage, but they put some of those different ones in at 10% of dry matter. So 5-6 pounds dry matter, and fed those. And what they saw was some differences between them as far as corn silages go, but yet the triticale and the wheat, oats, they certainly did great. Interesting diets look like a little low on protein in that milk for whatever reason, but nonetheless compared very favorably, replacing some of the corn silage. And sometimes that might be a good thing, because corn silage, when we get high corn silage diets, we might have a lot of starch there. We may need to cool that down a little bit. So here again, you see the NDF across there, meaning that, yep, you got corn silage at 40% NDF, you got triticale and wheat, small grains in the low 50s, the oats. Those are good. And so it was good quality forage. And again, it's possible. Something else, certainly, you look around our neck of the woods with the hills on the hill and the slopes and the valleys and stuff. Again, putting in the cover crop coming off after corn silage, really good thing to kind of start trying to work into if you haven't been doing it already. We just need to save these topsoils. We take corn silage off, we got a lot of bare ground out there. And so if we can get some, whether it's cereal grain, winter cereal rye or whatever, it's good to do that. And we got enough biomass there that we're going to actually accomplish something. And whether you take it off as forage in the spring, whether you graze it before you terminate it, you got some options there. And it doesn't have to be super fancy forage, but it can be something that helps. Maybe it's a place that, you know, the calves go out after they calve in the spring, and we've got a place that's cleaner, drier for them. Again, gives us options. And I am, like I say, I like to have the cover crops. I like to have that part of our systems. Borrowed this from Practical Farmers of Iowa. And yeah, don't farm naked, plant cover crops. So that's a tribute or a acknowledgement to Margaret, by the way, that we have that in there. So kind of in summary, small grain forages offers excellent options. And I think lots of different potentials. I think it's things to work with, you know, where you're buying the seed, what your nutritionist is thinking, kind of everybody get on the same page, talk through it. And again, start looking at 3 to 5 year plans and how my rotations are going to go. What do I want to do if I'm raising corn silage? I think, you know, when we got livestock, that offers us opportunities to capture additional value with the cover crops. But we also have a potential for emergency forages, forage supply, and we can put up some really good forage. And so it's something that we should be on the table for discussion. So with that, if there's any questions, certainly we got a little time, but I know, you know, I'm standing between you and getting something to eat here. If you haven't jumped up from the meeting here going on and grabbed something already, but we certainly want to answer your questions if you've got them. Otherwise, I certainly thank you for your time and attention here as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jim. Really appreciate your presentation today and all the work you put into contributing to the program. We really appreciate your time and expertise. And it really great kind of cap to this morning theme here of diversifying rotations too. And I think through Jim's talk, we definitely saw a lot of opportunities. There were some questions earlier on this morning about, ways to diversify your rotation or ways to kind of fit other forage crops into more of a traditional crop rotation. I think we've gotten a lot of great ideas to chew on, so to speak. And there are a couple questions here for you before we take a quick break. After corn silage, is it possible to plant both oats and winter rye together? I would say yes, but you can elaborate on that.
Yeah. Certainly nothing wrong with that. And it's interesting. I've actually observed that where people have done that. You try to get that oat growth, and whether you are able or want to graze it in the fall, you do get that faster growth there. And in the oats, if you don't graze it or harvest it in any way, it will die out. Nothing wrong with that. Got it covered there. And then in the spring, the cereal rye should start coming along fine. And diversity. I always say Mother Nature likes diversity. I always like more than one thing planted if we can do it.
Yeah, and I like you're bringing the soil health equation into the conversation as well, because that's definitely something to think about with all these forage crops. Is it really allows us not only to capture multiple planting windows as benefits for animals, but also for the soil too. It gives us a lot of windows to really.
Yeah, and that's one thing. I didn't have that picture in here, but I had some pictures of roots on small grain crops, and they've got a vigorous root and fibrous, and it's good part of soil health.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any recommendations on planting? You were talking about winter rye on corn silage ground. Any pros, cons about seeding perennial forages after that, like an alfalfa or grass, after that would come off, or is that more of a better fit for other crops to come after?
Well, I think it's a better fit for other crops, mostly because what are we going to do in the spring? Because if we're planting alfalfa and things, we want to get that in there. We don't want to plant that alfalfa seed, alfalfa grass in the fall. But how early would we be able to do that in the spring? And then with the grasses, will we get a allelopathic effect at all? Or are we going to scratch it out? Some trade-offs there. I don't think that's the best option way to do that.